Rich, do you remember the movie Angels in the Outfield?
You know, that's one of those movies where I vaguely remember a plot about a kid playing for the Angels, not the Bears. The Cubs. That's Rookie of the Year, but I don't know the plot in its entirety. Why do you ask?
Yeah, so he doesn't play for them. He sees Angels and he sees them helping the actual baseball team out, right? I watched it recently with my daughter. It is as putrid as you probably think it would be. It's a terrible, terrible movie when you go back and watch it. It was fine growing up, but it's terrible right now. But I was thinking I might need, Christopher Lloyd was the main angel in that movie. I might need to do the little angel sign, flap my wings a little bit, get Christopher Lloyd down here, and fix my Kimani Vidal and potentially Tyrone Tracy lineups. I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years. But there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have. And I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest. And I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro. Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'm JJ Zacharyson. First episode with glasses, Rich. And I'm joined, I just spoiled it. I'm joined by Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, buddy?
Doing good, man. I almost went 8 eyes. 6 eyes might not be enough, but
there we go.
But yeah, I'll go no glasses here. Purposefully wearing the Jets hat just to prove that even in times of turmoil, absolute clown organization looking like a bunch of idiots with regards to the Hassan Reddick contract negotiation or lack thereof. I'm a fan through and through. I'm here for the bad times, and with the Jets, mostly the bad times.
Yeah. It's really funny. I saw someone quote tweet that the Reddick trade request in the tweet about that. One of the beats who sent that out. And quote tweeted it with the Aaron Rodgers quote of him saying that people will take like a discount to go play in Green Bay. Because I'm playing here. It's just such a perfect chef's kiss situation going on there.
Yeah, I don't understand a player who they knew needed a new contract. You execute a trade without a contract in place. And lo and behold, it turns out kicking the can down the road, not a very good strategy.
Yeah, I mean, as we're seeing with Brandon Aiyuk right now, who, by the way, I recorded this earlier today, the interview later with Neil Orfield, which you guys will listen to in just a second. Recorded it earlier today, and we talked a little bit about Brandon Aiyuk and that whole situation. And at the time, when we were recording it, we were kind of assuming that Aiyuk was leaning towards the 49ers. And then literally right after we were done recording, we get this rap sheet tweet saying that it's kind of like it's just up in the air. We don't know. Is it going to be Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh has a deal on the table, or is he going to sign this extension with the 49ers? So by the time you listen to this show, a couple things might be different. Number one, I mentioned Tyrone Tracy at the top. Earlier today, we got news that he had this horrific injury. He was carted off. He had an air cast. He went to the hospital. And then recently, right before we started recording, we learned that Tyrone Tracy's injury might not be that bad. So, that cold open we did, I did mention Tracy, but if he's okay, then my best ball rosters and lineups will feel much, much better. Much better.
Undertaker.gif. I mean, when the Aircast comes out, season's over, right?
Like what are the percent? I know that they're overly cautious in training camp and stuff like that, but like, what are the odds of it being nothing major when the Aircast happens, right? Like it's got to be
single digit.
You're playing, yeah, right. You're playing like 5% at best, probably at this point. And so, crossing my fingers. Again, a lot of this information, by the time you listen to this episode, you might know what's going down with some of these guys, whether Aiyuk gets traded, whether Tyrone Tracy is or is not hurt. But let's hope that we get some conclusions soon for the Aiyuk stuff, and let's hope that Tyrone Tracy, not just for our bags, that's not the most important thing. Most important thing, it's just, I feel like the older I get, the more devastating those injuries feel to me with these younger, a rookie who just worked his butt off to get where he is, and just a devastating injury like that. It's sort of like watching like Cam Akers the last couple of years with the Achilles. It's like, come on, man. Like, give this guy, or J.K. Dobbins, like, just give this dude a break. Like, he deserves a break. He's clearly working his butt off to get back on the field. It's really, really difficult to watch.
Especially running back too, man. These guys, the only time these guys get to maximize their value is their second contract, because, and even then we're seeing how the league has shifted into not paying players at that position on their second contract. They'll give them the franchise tag, and that's about it. So when these guys get hurt young, it's even more brutal.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about last week. Greg Bryant, listener of the show, gave two draft guides, and we were talking about how this episode will drop at 6 a.m. Eastern on Wednesdays, and it did. And surprisingly, we talked about, we're like, oh, someone on the East Coast is going to win this. Surprisingly, the two winners happened about 20 minutes after 6 a.m., and the two winners were not in the Eastern time zone. One of them was in Wisconsin. The other one was in Iowa. I saw one email was someone was at the gym at like 4:30 in the morning, and that's why they were able to get the guide. So a couple early birds got the W there, which is good to see, because I didn't want it to be super, super East Coast biased.
Big Ten stand up. Defense wins championships. Heart of America.
That's right. All right. Rich, there's one topic that I definitely want to get to today, and that is Kimani Vidal. We had a report come out, not really report, it was an article projecting the 53 of the Los Angeles Chargers. It's from Daniel Popper of The Athletic, and he came out and said that he thinks the Chargers carry 4 running backs, and those 4 running backs are Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, Isaiah Spiller, and Jarrett Patterson, not Kimani Vidal. And the fantasy football space has been losing their minds, because there's a lot of truthers out there, and there are a lot of people who were pooping on the truthers throughout the offseason who are now victory lapping based on this article. So I want to throw out a few thoughts about this, because I really haven't had a platform to do so, and I don't really want to go to Twitter and have a nuanced conversation, because that's just not what Twitter's for at this point. So my feeling is, I do think there's this possibility. Kimani Vidal got injured early on in training camp, and he hasn't shown off his abilities. Whether they're there or not, we don't know fully, right? And if you look at this story that Popper put together, it's 100% based on what he's seen and what he's experienced. And when a guy like Vidal hasn't been playing, of course, he wouldn't be making the final 53, because we don't know what he looks like and how he fits in this offense, right? I think that in this scenario, he might end up being like a practice squad player, right? At the end of the day. And that's a problem, because a lot of us, including myself, I've been drafting Kimani Vidal. I've talked about it on this show in the past, all that good stuff. But I don't think it's over. I think right now I'd probably give it a 50-50 shot. I don't think it's even leaning towards a more favorable outcome of him not making the team than making the team. I'll say it's 50-50. I've stopped drafting him at the moment because I just don't want to take the 0 or the potential 0. And I have enough Kimani Vidal, clearly, from the 14th round on, that I've drafted throughout the offseason. But look, the argument for Vidal, from me, my argument, was not simply because of situation. It was also, I liked the dude as a prospect. Like, I thought that he was a good pass catcher. He's a great pass protector, or he at least profiled that way. And I didn't expect him to take over the early down work, but I thought that he could play a DeAndre Swift-ish type role in that offense. And it's an offense that Gus Edwards never saw more than 13 targets in a season. J.K. Dobbins, coming off the injury, always injured. He stayed healthy so far. And I think that's the one thing we have to always keep in mind while we're looking at all this preseason stuff and any preseason injuries that we might see, or just preseason hype and how depth charts shake out and that kind of stuff. Like, the idea behind Vidal and his situation is not going to come to fruition until the season gets going, because the idea is that a guy like J.K. Dobbins won't be able to hold up throughout the entire season. So if you're letting go of Kimani Vidal in in Dynasty, or if you think that he's absolutely not going to make the team, then you're doing that maybe because you don't like the talent, or you're believing that the team just doesn't like the talent and they see something, but you're also giving up on the idea that the situation actually is pretty favorable for another running back to step in. And so you should be really buying heavily into J.K. Dobbins, right? Like, because that's the biggest number one guy in the way of any of the running backs that are below him and Gus Edwards on the depth chart. So my take is, I think Kimani Vidal was a good prospect. Like, was he a great prospect? No. Like, let's get that out of the way. He's a day 3 running back. Okay. The hit rates of day 3 running backs are extremely, extremely small to begin with. So when I sit here on a podcast and I say, go draft Kimani Vidal, or he's a good pick, or he's a good player, that's within the context of where he was drafted. I don't think that he's a better player than guys who were drafted on day 2, let's say. But I do think that versus cost and his profile, he does look good. And I did think that, and I still do think that the situation is sort of ripe for a bottom-tiered running back on a depth chart to rise and become a fantasy producer in some way. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people were drafting Vidal strictly because of the situation, and now they're saying, I shouldn't have done that. But it's like, okay, well, I actually like the talent. Like, I liked the talent throughout. And so, again, to recap though, I don't think that it's a given that he's going to get cut at all. I am not drafting him anymore though. I think that if you have a season-long draft this weekend, you should still draft Kimani Vidal in the last round, because you can make up for that. It's different in best ball. And I do think as I go on this best ball bro journey and experience, it's a really good learning for me of, this is kind of a season-long brain taking over with Vidal and how I thought about Vidal, when, we do have to shift our focus a little bit to not take zeros in best ball.
Yeah. And the Jared Patterson bit is interesting, because this is a guy, he hasn't had any reasonable volume since 2021 with the Commanders. He doesn't play a role on special teams, because when he was signed to the Chargers last year, he didn't even see the field. He was a practice squad player. He went back to the Commanders as well, also a practice squad player there. Didn't see the game day roster to play on special teams, and he's got no guaranteed money. So the Chargers are still incentivized to find a way, if they can, to get Kimani Vidal onto this roster. It's just that if the player isn't ready, or if they're injured, they're not going to be able to do so. There is some optimism. I saw Hayden Winks tweeting about this, where they treated him and Ladd McConkey the exact same way this past weekend with regards to some injury management. They both warmed up pregame and then went to street clothes. So there is a hint of optimism there. But I think you do make a good distinction there, where we still should have somewhat of an eye on him, perhaps in season managed leagues, where we can just cut him if nothing comes of it. Whereas best ball, taking that zero can be a little bit too risky.
Yeah, 100%. And like, I'm okay with being wrong about stuff. I don't care. I'm trying to give you guys exactly what I think is going on right now, where I think there's still a shot that he makes the team. I don't think that an athletic beat and someone who puts together an article is the end all with that discussion. And like you said, like, I've seen people say like, oh, Jarrett Patterson is a better prospect, or was a better prospect than Kimani Vidal. I don't even disagree with that. He was a freak from a production standpoint in college. The problem is we have a relatively large sample now of him bouncing around the NFL. And so, could he have gotten it together? And could this coaching staff in particular just really, really like him? Of course. But we got to use the evidence that we have. And I still think that straight up, the potential, the upside still would favor a guy like Vidal over Patterson. And the reason we're not bringing Spiller up is because he is a special teams guy and would be able to hypothetically, fill that role. I do think they're going to carry 4 though, because they do have a lot of question marks from a health perspective, and it's going to be a pretty run heavy team too.
So running back is a position where we see a lot of shifting opinion here in the preseason, because we know how important volume is at the position to drive value. And there's 2 players here that you specifically want to also touch upon a bit more positively. And you started this discussion last week with regards to Kenneth Walker on perspectives, where previously you were probably below market. You've now shifted to market. And now, while there's so much positive buzz coming out with regards to Walker, being involved in the receiving game, the market's not budging positively. He's only up 2 spots since we last spoke last week. So talk about K9 out in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I've oddly gone from, because we're kind of just we're playing probability is what I always say, right? Whenever we're making these selections, and you look at a guy like Walker, and I said this on Perspectives. I'm not sure that Kenneth Walker is a great elite pass catcher. I don't think he is. If you look back at his college profile, he was never a high volume receiver. The last 2 years in the NFL, the 2 years that he's been in the NFL, he's had sub 8% target share per game rates, hasn't been a high volume receiver. Like, there's 5 years of data right there where he hasn't been a high volume receiver. With that being said, do I think that he's like a bad pass catcher out of the backfield? No, I don't think he's bad. I think that like Miles Sanders is pretty bad out of the backfield as a pass catcher. And I think that someone like Christian McCaffrey is elite as a pass catcher out of the backfield. You're going to have these sort of anchors on either end of that spectrum. And then you're going to have just this giant group of players who are above average to below average at being a pass catcher out of the backfield. Where Kenneth Walker sits is probably around average, maybe a little below average, just based on the volume that we've seen from him. And I know that people are going to look at like his yards per route run last year. Go look at his yards per route run as a rookie. Those types of metrics are not stable year over year when you're looking at those efficiency metrics. You should look at volume first and foremost. That is a great indicator of future volume as a pass catcher, just in general, right? You're going to see outliers and such, but generally speaking, a guy who is a good pass catcher in the NFL down throughout his entire career was a good pass catcher to start his NFL career. We rarely see a guy who doesn't see a 10% target share during his first 2 years all of a sudden see a 12, 13% target share. So with that being said, in best ball, I wasn't totally avoiding Kenneth Walker because I think that his home run ability, fits the format relatively well. And obviously, we always talk about contingent upside of the RB2s, but there is some contingent upside too with Walker if Zach Charbonnet would go down, right? So I haven't really been against Walker, and I've even wrote about this in my draft guide. I haven't been against Walker in best ball per se. I just have a lot more Charbonnet, and when people see that, they just assume, oh, you don't have that much Kenneth Walker. I was probably at like 5%, 6% maybe Walker before all of this happened, right? So I was below market, but it wasn't like I was completely fading him. Now, though, like you said, we're getting reports that they want to use him more as a pass catcher out of the backfield, and I'm like, okay, well, his ADP is going to spike because we're seeing these reports coming out, and it hasn't really. I mean, to me, he belongs probably in that Mixon Rachaad White tier, I think. Like, I don't think it's that crazy to think that, especially in a best ball environment where we know the big playability is there, to say that Walker should be closer to that range than he currently is. And he's just not. He's still being drafted, like you said, just a couple of spots above where he was prior to all of this coach speak. So I've obviously been in on Zach Charbonnet. I'm at like 19-20% right now. Charbonnet, he's one of my highest rostered running backs, if not the highest rostered running back. My exposure is relatively flat. I don't really have any guys over 20%, just the way that things kind of have shaken out. But yeah, I mean, like, I'm absolutely pouncing on this Kenneth Walker stuff right now because his ADP just hasn't budged.
We talked about the injury to Tyrone Tracy to start the program. Another injury to a rookie running back, and that's out in Green Bay with Marshawn Lloyd. However, his veteran counterpart, another player you've been cool on based on the ambiguity in the backfield, Josh Jacobs, he's only up 1.5 spots. So we've got these two veterans with two very clear stories that should be driving a drumbeat of positivity, but like his counterpart, Kenneth Walker, he's not budging.
Yeah. Look, I feel stronger about a Jacobs fade than I do a Kenneth Walker fade, like even in season long, right? Like also, I felt like that all summer. I've just not really bought into Josh Jacobs based on Matt LaFleur's history. Jacobs had a really rough season last year. His explosiveness wasn't totally the same, especially when you look at like 10 plus yard runs. Rich Rebar and I talked about it at length on the episode of Late Round Podcast from yesterday. But yeah, I mean, like with Jacobs now, it's a little bit different because Marshawn Lloyd is now entering the season with this injury that he's dealing with. And I don't know how long it's going to linger. No one really knows how long it's going to linger. And yet Jacobs has barely moved from an ADP perspective. When we first started talking about fading Jacobs, he was like a 3-4 turn pick at the beginning of becoming a best ball bro, right? Like
he's down a full round, 12.8 selections since we started podcasting.
Yeah, so I feel good about that fade and the way that I've handled Jacobs, but now, he's settled. We know where he generally is going to go, and Marshawn Lloyd's banged up. AJ Dillon isn't that big of a threat, in my opinion, from a talent standpoint, where they're going to, even though LaFleur has these tendencies, we may still see them force Jacobs a little bit more if Marshawn Lloyd is sidelined. I have plenty of Marshawn Lloyd, another guy that I drafted a good bit of, maybe in that 15-16% range. We'll eventually get to my exposures and stuff on the last episode of the show. But, I have a decent amount of Marshawn Lloyd, not a ton of Josh Jacobs, maybe like 3% Jacobs, 4% Jacobs. But yeah, with his ADP not falling, I'm fine with pouncing on it. I think this is where the edges are coming this year, is that people are oddly only reactive to the players who are actually getting hurt. Like Jahmyr Gibbs right now, at the time of this recording, we don't know exactly how long he's going to be out. Jahmyr Gibbs goes from a 1-2 turn guy to, I did a BBM earlier today. He's a mid-second round pick. Things are definitely shit. And that's a lot of equity when you're talking about early rounds. But that's himself. I haven't really seen what's going on with like David Montgomery quite yet, but it seems like the effect, we have like the cause of these individual players, but the effect of that hasn't really been shifting as much as I thought it would. We saw it with Deebo Samuel, with the Brandon Aiyuk stuff, but not George Kittle, not Ricky Pearsall, not Jawan Jennings. So I think that having that understanding of how things sort of trickle down on a depth chart can be really, really helpful this time of year.
The place where I am seeing a lot of ADP moves at running back are kind of these later round dart throws where people feel like it's almost like a mystery box. So I put 3 in the show sheet here. Chase Brown is up 6 spots. He's up 20 spots since we started. Braylon Allen is up 9 spots week over week, up 33 spots since we started potting. And then you've got Jordan Mason with this buzz about him perhaps being the number 2 behind Christian McCaffrey. He's up 13 spots. He was completely undrafted for the first 7 weeks of the show. So I feel like people are just favoring these kind of mystery box options that are more dart throws, as opposed to players who we know are going to see the field, and we kind of are learning that their volume could be more than we suspected in pretty good offenses.
I wonder how much of it has to do with people having priors. The Jordan Mason thing's a little bit different because, he's looking like he could be the RB2, so naturally people are just kind of going to throw a dart in the 18th round and see what they get out of him. But like Braylon Allen, a lot of people, my model loved Braylon Allen, and I was subjectively kind of like pushing him down a little bit in my rankings, which seems like it was a mistake because my model, I need to just trust my model all the time at this point. But yeah, he looks great. And there's a reason why he's rising, of course, because of what we've seen. But a lot of people liked Braylon Allen as a prospect and as a player. Chase Brown, we have this prior of these ambiguous backfields, and a lot of people just naturally favored Chase Brown a little bit. So when we get this news that he is going to be the dude, or he could be the dude, then people are going to probably overinflate. I'm still drafting Chase Brown generally where he goes, but people are probably going to overinflate, how high we should be pushing that individual player. But when we're talking about like Josh Jacobs, where there's a pretty split community on him, and the people who like Josh Jacobs probably already got a lot of Josh Jacobs bags, and they're afraid of drafting him still. There are a lot of Jacobs, in the first 5 rounds, because there are a lot of people who are against that. To your point, when you're looking at these like later round picks, it's like, who cares? It doesn't matter. The opportunity cost isn't very high. But then these earlier rounds, I think that's why we probably see what we're seeing with Walker and Jacobs in particular.
I will say, as the resident Jets fan here, Braylon looked great. The thing that I took away the most was it feels like the line could be fixed, which I think has as much of an impact perhaps on Rodgers and the pass catchers as well. All right, players you've been drafting. We already talked about K9 and Josh Jacobs, but let's head out to the Bay, where once again, Aiyuk, will he or won't he? The one player who probably, at least one of the players that could have the biggest boost with his absence is George Kittle, but his ADP has not budged, only 1.6 spots since this whole scuttlebutt began, and you've been grabbing some Kittle.
Yeah, I've been trying to. I think that realistically, I always try to envision like, what would this look like? And I talk about this with our guest today. What would this look like if this thing did go down. If Aiyuk were not on San Francisco, I think where Debo gets drafted now is probably where he would get drafted, because I think it'd be a little difficult to probably put him over like Garrett Wilson and Puka. But I think putting him over someone like Drake London or even Marvin Harrison makes sense, especially in a best ball environment. With George Kittle, I think realistically he becomes like a Dalton Kincaid value, like in that same range. But I don't think he's going to even get close to getting into that like early to mid 5th round range over an underdog. So yeah, I mean, I think that he could rise and he will rise if the Aiyuk thing officially happens. And if he does move, I think right now that whole thing is just 50-50. Like we don't know either way what's going to go down, but I'm fine with buying into it because again, his ADP hasn't budged. And I actually thought that Kittle has been an okay enough pick to begin with, like regardless of all of this. And so now you add this extra layer of his target share could be more consistent, and we won't have even the crazy roller coaster that we always get with George Kittle. I mean, he could really, really crush this year if they lose Brandon Aiyuk, but even if they don't, I think that he's still a decent pick.
Yeah, he's always been a spike week king, man. Like Kittle just has these random weeks where he crushes, multiple touchdown weeks. So if we can flatten out that target haul over the 17-week season, that'd be really good. All right, round 18. Some guys you're throwing some darts on. We talked about Juwan Jennings. Still love that. But some other younger guys here, rookies, Javon Baker. We got Johnny Wilson. And the buzz out here in LA, has McVay done it again with Jordan Whittington?
The Jordan Whittington stuff is interesting to me. He's kind of like a hybrid, not hybrid. He started his college career as sort of like a hybrid player. Like he could play in the backfield and play some running back and stuff. I remember doing his research for his profile for the prospect guide, and I remember looking at what my model was saying in terms of draft capital delta, which is where a guy was drafted versus what my model is saying about that player, and just kind of subtracting the percentiles of draft capital percentile minus overall what percentile he and what his score generally looks like. And he had a favorable draft capital delta, and that was driven a lot by a teammate score that I have in the model because he played alongside A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy. And so naturally you're not going to have as strong of numbers playing alongside those guys, but he is kind of a versatile guy. Like his numbers weren't overly amazing. I don't think this is, I sent a tweet out that said something along the lines of like, there's not going to be a this year's Puka Nacua, even though every content piece says there is a this year's, who's this year's Puka Nacua.
Of course.
And a lot of it,
gotta get those clicks.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And a lot of people are responding saying that it's Jordan Whittington. Look, I get the buzz, I get the hype, and we literally just saw it from this team last year, but there isn't, with Puka Nacua, there was at least a crazy per route run profile in terms of his production that does not necessarily exist for a guy like Whittington. And so I'm much more inclined, of course I'm working in hindsight, but I'm trying my best to only think of them as prospects. Nacua and Whittington, like I do think that Whittington will play and can play the slot, which could be a little bit interesting given what they have, but I think that they'll want to use Cooper Kupp there a decent bit. And, they liked what they had out of Demarcus Robinson down the stretch. And Demarcus Robinson's a good blocker, and they love to have good blocking wide receivers in that scheme and in that system. So do I think Whittington is the wide receiver 4 who could see some work in the offense scattered out throughout the season and maybe, a little bit of an uptick if one of these guys gets hurt? Of course, yeah. So I think that because of that, he's a decent 18th round dart throw at this point. But from a season-long perspective, I don't think he's really draftable right now. If we see something in week 1 like we did with Puka last year, like last year I was saying, even in my draft guide, I said Puka Nacua was a late-round dart throw, right? Like to me, this is not the same situation. This is similar to how people speak to me about Isaiah Pacheco to Deneric Prince, where I liked Pacheco a lot as a prospect.
The Chiefs have rotated in another number 2 running back this week.
Yeah, but like how
R.I.P. Deneric Prince.
Exactly. Like you've seen it in the Discord for the last year since the Chiefs got Deneric Prince, where people have said, "Hey, Jay, like should I be picking him up in Dynasty and stuff?" I'm like, sure, throw the dart in Dynasty, keep him on your bench. I'm not like whatever. I don't really care about that, but don't expect the Isaiah Pacheco outcome for him because Pacheco was a better prospect. There were a lot of more favorable marks for a player like Pacheco than there are for Deneric Prince. He did not have the same type of production profile. I feel similarly with Whittington versus a guy like Puka Nacua, where at least Nacua had some really, really intriguing yards per route run numbers that you could latch onto and say, why wasn't BYU using him more than they were using him, right? Whereas, of course, we know why Jordan Whittington wasn't getting as much run as he could have. And I think that naturally we should, this is why I have a teammate score in the first place. Like, you can't just ignore that team context. But I do think that Nacua was just naturally a better prospect than him. And then, the last two, Johnny Wilson's running with the 3, or running as the wide receiver 3 pretty often for Philadelphia. I think that he could be sort of like a potential Chase Claypool type player without maybe the stuff going on between the ears. Because I think that's sort of what derailed Chase Claypool's career to some degree. But yeah, I mean, he's a really interesting prospect. He had really good efficiency mark or fairly good efficiency marks to the point where he was better than a lot, like depending on the metric you look at, you could say that he looked better than Keon Coleman during their final season. So I think Johnny Wilson's pretty interesting and intriguing. And then Javon Baker, who I don't think would have been going nearly as late in the NFL draft had he not had some like off the field question marks. Really good prospect. I thought that he was just a very, very solid. He had very, very solid marks across the board within my model. Baker's one of my highest rostered wide receivers right now. I like throwing, like I have Jalen Polk, I have Demario Douglas. We've talked about Douglas plenty on this show, but Polk's ADP has risen quite a bit over the last couple of months. Fortunately, I got him pretty early on, and I haven't drafted him as much of late. But I do think Javon Baker, he sometimes goes undrafted in these drafts. Like, I've still seen that. I've gotten him at 18-12 before, like in the very last pick of the draft. So to me, Javon Baker, I still think has a non-zero chance of being the wide receiver you want out of New England. I'd still rank it as Polk, Demario Douglas, and Baker. But Baker, I think the gap is just like, I think Baker should be a 17th round pick instead of an 18th round pick.
Yeah, Jalen Polk, 24 picks since we first started. 2 full rounds of steam for the rookie in New England. Yeah, for me, going back to the Rams real quick, if there's one clear thing to take away from Los Angeles this weekend, it's that they sat all of their starters on offense, and that included Colby Parkinson, who continues to go in the 200s, up 0.7 spots since last week. This guy is the tight end 1 in LA.
Yeah, I like that call a lot. I'm in the Kings Classic, which was a draft that we did in Canton that we do at the Fantasy Football Expo each year. There's 2 leagues. It's kind of like a relegation system. And I was drafting, you do a snake draft and then an auction draft back to back. And it's intense. I was drafting for like 7 straight hours. It was a pretty intense, nerdy situation there. But I got Colby Parkinson in one of those leagues. Same exact reason, same exact logic. He could have a legit role this year. I like it. Anyway, let's get to this interview, man. I talked to Neil Orfield. He's a high volume best ball player. He's been very, very successful in the DFS space. He does work for sites like Fantasy Points, Roto Grinders, 4for4. He also has his own YouTube channel. He talks about that at the end of the interview. We chat about coach speak, how it impacts his drafts, how injuries are impacting his drafts. Like I said, we talked about some of the stuff that we just talked about, but also like the Brandon Aiyuk trade and such. But how he's drafting now versus how he was drafting in May and June, and tons more. It was a great interview. He's a great guy. I think you guys will enjoy it. So without further ado, here is my interview and chat with Neil Orfield. This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. There's no better place to play best ball than at Underdog. There are leagues starting all the time, and you can choose whether you want to do a slow draft or a fast one when entering one of those leagues. And you don't just have to play Best Ball Mania to play Best Ball at Underdog. There's a wide variety of contests to choose from. You can even check out Underdog's other games as well, like Pick'em. Right now, you can get in on the action with a deposit offer and free copy of the late round draft guide just by signing up and depositing. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND and make a deposit for a deposit offer and a free copy of the late round draft guide. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. All right, Neil, even right before we hopped on here to start talking best ball a little bit, we get word that JJ McCarthy has an injury. Tyrone Tracy seemingly has a long-term injury, or at least that's the scare right now. By the time folks listen to this episode, they will probably know what's going on with those players, or exactly what's going on with those players. So we're in this period right now in August where there's a lot of injuries that are occurring across the league. And when those injuries occur from a best ball perspective, are you automatically sort of taking those players off your draft list? Now, obviously, someone who's out for the year, you would take them off of your draft list. But, we've seen some injuries like with a DeAndre Hopkins, for instance, or even a Hollywood Brown, where, they're not out for the year by any means. Either guy could hypothetically play week 1, but, they might be out week 1, week 2, or into the start of the season. How do you approach that? Are you saying, yes, I'm going to fade these guys because I don't want to deal with these injured players, and that's just a sign of what's to come? Or are you taking on that discount?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the player and how bullish I was on them prior to the injury, how serious I think the injury is. So the example, JJ McCarthy, he was an 18th round pick anyway, so I'm not going to be buying JJ McCarthy now when I don't need to, when there's uncertainty with that injury. Kendra Miller was another guy that was like a little bit earlier than JJ McCarthy. So like you can buy the dip a little bit. He was end of 12th round kind of player as it was. I stopped buying into Kendra Miller at that point for a little while, where I'm like, it sounds like there's real risk cut risk potential here with the coach speak kind of being like, if you can't even get on the field, you're not going to make the team. So that's a situation where I kind of did. I wouldn't say I removed him from my board entirely, but kind of moved him down into that 17th, 18th round range. Right. So there's kind of levels to it where if you were already kind of on the cusp of I'm willing to draft you, I'm just removing you from my board. If you're in that kind of mid-range level, like a Kendra Miller, I mean, Josh Downs, he's a little bit better than Kendra Miller. Don't think I would remove Josh Downs from my board entirely right now as things stands, but I'm moving them down my list. But then like the top of the board, we have Jahmyr Gibbs. Yesterday, we get news he has a hamstring injury. We don't know the severity of it. I'm not going to remove Jahmyr Gibbs from my board. Also easier for me because I have a whole portfolio of lineups. I'm going to have hundreds and hundreds of lineups.
Right.
So it's easier for me to kind of take on some of that risk. But now with the Jahmyr Gibbs injury, if he does move to, say, the third round, from the 1-2 turn to the third round in best ball, now I'm going to have combos of Jahmyr Gibbs that people have not been able to get to this point. And we've got, best ball mania is 65% full. 65% of people will not have the opportunity to have drafted Jahmyr Gibbs in the third round. So that's a scenario where, I'm not removing from my board. If you are just doing one best ball draft, I could understand wanting to remove somebody like Jahmyr Gibbs from your board, because like you don't want to. That's no fun. If you draft a player in the first round or third round even, and then they're hurt, that just kind of kills your entire lineup. But for me, as somebody with a whole portfolio of lineups, I'm willing to take on that risk when there is uncertainty with a player like Jahmyr Gibbs of his level, where I can get combos that other people are not going to have, could have a potentially killer team if the hamstring injury doesn't turn into something that's going to keep him out for very long. So there really is a lot of nuance to it. The level of the player, the severity of the injury, a lot of that comes into play. You mentioned DeAndre Hopkins. I've kind of been, I haven't really been buying the dip, but I'm, kind of want to see where he would settle. He hasn't fallen enough where I'm like, I need, he's not falling to pick 120 where I'm like, I'm definitely taking this risk all the time. He's dipped a little bit. I still think, it's worth buying the dip often on injured players that are kind of in the top 100 picks.
Is there any difference in approach for you from like a portfolio management standpoint? If you like, let's say with Jahmyr Gibbs, you had 20% Gibbs because you were really, really into him, which I don't know if there's anyone on the planet that has that much Jahmyr Gibbs, but let's say that you have like 20 or 30% Jahmyr Gibbs, and then he falls, past where you've been drafting him because of this injury. Does that make you lean into him even more, or are you now afraid because now obviously other people are getting this massive discount on Gibbs, and you're just trying to make sure that you're not overcommitting yourself to a pretty volatile asset now that he is injured?
Yeah, I would say more the latter for me. I'm more inclined to take my foot off the gas pedal. Kendra Miller was actually the perfect example. He was a guy that I was super in on, was really buying a lot of Kendra Miller around pick 140. And then we started hearing like, he's not looking great at camp. So that's even before the injury, like he's not looking that great at camp. I'm like, I have, 20% Kendra Miller. I don't want to keep loading that bags on a player who really could be a zero. Then you add on, no injuries and stuff. Then I'm taking my foot off the gas. Typically, Jahmyr Gibbs I think if I had 20%, if he was somebody that I had moved up to like the Bijan range, where there probably are people who do have a ton of Jahmyr Gibbs for that reason. I think for me, I would be taking my foot off the gas pedal. Again, it is nuanced. There gets to a certain point. Then if he is the end of the third round and I was super bullish on him and we don't really know the severity of the injury, then sure, I'm buying him all day at the end of the third round, but I'm probably not taking him up. Like if the dip is to pick 16 or 17, like still like early mid second round, I'm probably taking my foot off the gas. I'm going to let things settle, add some other players into my portfolio a little bit more.
Yeah, and I like your thought. If anyone's playing Best Ball Mania, I like your thought of the different combos that folks are going to be getting. If he does, because like there's been drafts where I've gotten him at like 18th overall anyway, and so know that he's fallen to that point even before this injury happened. So if that's where his ADP settles, it's like, okay, we've seen the combination of even like a Bijan Gibbs start or something like that, or even a Justin Jefferson Gibbs start. Like it's definitely happened, but a CMC Gibbs start, like that kind of combination really hasn't happened as much. And then, also with CMC and Gibbs, you get the week 17 correlation. So,
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. There are now remembering last year, and it ended up being a pretty big mistake. But Cooper Kupp was that guy for me, where it was like we kind of got a late injury, where it was like we don't really know what severity is going to be. And I was like, I can get Justin Jefferson with Cooper Kupp, like I'm jamming that. And of course, didn't work out. But yeah, once you can get those kind of unique combos that people have not been able to get up to this point, and it's happening later in the season, so like not that many people are going to be able to take advantage of it. Then I'm pretty interested in getting those unique combos.
Yeah, love that from a game theory perspective. So now we are drafting later in the season, like you mentioned. BBM. I mean, by the time that people listen to this, it could be closer to 70% filled. People are playing more and more. While you're drafting later versus how you drafted in May versus June, what do you think some of the biggest changes that you've made have been?
This is a really fun time to draft for me because there's just so much more information all the time about like teams rotations, who are going to be the lead receivers on this team, who is a cut risk. Sometimes there are players that we think are like a lock to make the lineup, and suddenly you're hearing, Kendra Miller. There's an example of like, Is he really a cut risk? I did not consider that he would be. But then other players moving up the board. Jordan Mason, you and I talked about him a little bit yesterday, is a player who I'm kind of interested in that. When I'm hearing that Jordan Mason may be the RB2, like he's in contention to be the RB2, that's a great situation. If you can be the RB2 on the Niners, that is awesome. So I'm at this point in the season, I'm really just in the drafting season, I'm really just reacting to camp news. A lot of the time because things can change pretty quickly. Last year was Rico Dowdle for me, was kind of the same situation where it was like never heard about, nobody talked about him up until like August. Like he was not somebody that many people were drafting. Suddenly they're saying Rico Dowdle looking like the Cowboys RB2. I'm like, the RB2 on an awesome offense. Yeah, that's a player that I want to add into my portfolio. So I started just hammering. I was drafting so much of Rico Dowdle last year in the 18th round. And I also think, we already mentioned like, things that were not going to be super owned. So you can take advantage of like players dipping, like Jahmyr Gibbs, get dipped, different combinations. But like Jordan Mason this year, Rico Dowdle last year, those are examples of players that like they haven't really been drafted to this point all that much in Best Ball Mania. So now you're also going to get a low owned player by reacting to that camp news. So I think the biggest difference for me now versus earlier in the season is I am just a news hound. I'm just, paying attention constantly. I have alerts on for several different accounts that are going to be telling me the news as it breaks, and I can react to that news in real time. And honestly, I probably overreact more than I should to some of the news, but I think paying attention to the news can be a huge advantage. Actually, I was not as in on this, and one of my bigger regrets last year, Kyren Williams was an example of like all of the reports in August were really good. Like the coaches love him. He's a great blocking running back. Some people took advantage of that and really benefited from it. So there are scenarios where you can benefit just from listening to the news in August.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're talking about like 17th, 18th round picks. We even talked about it yesterday a little bit. It's like when we were doing a live stream on your channel, which everyone should check out. But if you're in like round, the way I've kind of looked at it is like the difference between round 16, 17, and 18 from an opportunity cost standpoint and the kind of players that you're getting, it's marginal. There's not enough of a difference. And not only that, but the players that you're drafting in that range, it can be just a camp news item for us to be like, sure, I'll throw the dart at that guy as opposed to throwing a dart at some other guy who doesn't necessarily have that item, because again, the margins are just so small from one player to the next, where things can change, very, very, very quickly. And we should latch on to all of the news that we can possibly latch onto with those kinds of players, because at the end of the day, they're being drafted late because they're not the best players in the world. I mean, obviously they are because they're in the NFL, but compared to, some of the early round guys, they're not to that caliber. So latching on to some of that, the news items out there, and coach speak to some degree seems like a smart idea. Speaking of coach speak, sounds like you are leaning into it a little bit, maybe more than most, as you said, but how much do you care about coach speak? And has there been sort of a coach speak item or two throughout the last month or two that you've really latched onto and said, I'm gonna go in on this player based on what this coach is saying?
Yeah, so I do pay attention to coach speak. As I said, I probably overreact sometimes to some of this news, but I do think you can get, if you listen to what the coaches are actually saying, you can learn things from the coaches. I think, Matt LaFleur yesterday came out and said he wants to vomit when people talk about wide receiver ones, which, doesn't seem like that much of a, what is your takeaway from that? My takeaway from that is it kind of makes me like Dontavian Wicks a little bit better, and it kind of makes me like Jaden Reed a little bit worse. Like if they are going to run, which has kind of been our inclination all summer, has been like the Packers are going to have a wide receiver rotation. I made a tweet about Dontavian Wicks, a bullish Dontavian Wicks tweet last week, and somebody who responded was like, I'm a Packers fan. He's a wide receiver 4 on the Packers. Why would you want to have Dontavian Wicks on your team? And that's, a valid concern if you think like, well, the only reason he played last year is because Christian Watson got hurt and then Jaden Reed got hurt. So he had those opportunities. But I think, listening to what Matt LaFleur is saying, we don't have a wide receiver 1. We have several wide receiver 1s. We have several guys who can do lots of different things, does make me think like it is more likely that what we have been sort of assuming all along, that Dontavian Wicks is just going to be part of a rotation as opposed to just having contingent value if somebody goes down, seems more likely to me that he maybe is going to be just part of that rotation, the way Matt LaFleur has been talking about his wide receivers. Like, no, we don't have a wide receiver 1. We have a lot of different wide receivers who can do a lot of different things. That makes me, more bullish on the guys who are being drafted later, who were kind of concerned about them being part of that rotation, and a little bit more bearish on the guys who maybe we were thinking maybe he could be. Maybe Jaden Reed does get up to 95% snap share, rep participation, whatever this year. Makes me think it's probably less likely that that Jaden Reed does have 90+% route participation if Matt LaFleur does really think he has a wide receiver rotation going on. So there's an example of coach speak that I'm listening to it a little bit. You don't want to overreact to things. I also think I'm thinking back to DFS last year. There was a slate where the Seahawks were on an island game. So I was doing a showdown breakdown, and like right before I went live on a stream, somebody tweeted at me and said, "Hey Neil," an audience member from the show, "Hey Neil, check this out. I think that this could be Kenny McIntosh week, or McIntyre. I can't remember
McIntosh.
the name. Kenny McIntosh week. Yeah. Look at what Pete Carroll said," and it was like a Pete Carroll quote that a beat reporter responded and been like, "Looks like Kenny McIntosh could get some run on Monday Night Football." And then this guy tweets at me and says, "Hey Neil, we need to be jamming Kenny McIntosh." And I saw this right before I went live. I was like, "Oh, that's kind of exciting, this news item." And then I read the actual quote. Like I was pulled it up, on the stream. I was like, okay, let me read what the coach said, what Pete Carroll said. And it was basically like, yeah, he looks great in practice. We'd love to get him involved at some point. And it was like, oh, when you strip away all of the like narration from the beat reporter, all he said is what Pete Carroll says about every single one of his players. Like, he looks great. We'd love to get him involved. Like, this is actually nothing burger. So like, I went from, oh, this is really exciting, need to pay attention to this coach speak, to like, actually, if you just break it down to what the coach is actually saying, he didn't actually say anything all of that bullish. So I do think it is important to, listen to what the coach is saying, but maybe sometimes weed out the narration from beat reporters.
Yeah, I had Greg Branos on last week on Late Round Perspectives to talk about, he runs the Coach Speak Index. And I do, that's something that we talked about a lot, is just like there's a fine line of sort of overrating and overstating what's been said by these coaches. And obviously that's what Coach Speak Index is trying to help us solve and help us do and understand. And he does a great job doing that. But, I always lean in on like just asking the question, does this make sense? Right? Like, is this logical? And you look at like the Green Bay situation, does it make sense for them to have a rotation? Yeah, because each of those guys do different things at wide receiver and can do different things at wide receiver. So yeah, that should be the expectation. Now, obviously from like a contingent upside standpoint and all that kind of stuff with like injuries and whatnot, you can go down that path. But strictly from a if they're all healthy standpoint, I think the expectation should be that there's going to be some sort of rotation based on, and it's similar like Matt LaFleur has also talked about a rotation out of the backfield. Like he has openly talked about it. If it's coming from the coach's mouth like that, I think that it does matter to some degree. And then you have the evidence, right? You have the backing of how Green Bay's used their backfield, historically under LaFleur, how he used his backfield when he had Deion Lewis and Derrick Henry. There is at least evidence there. And when there is that evidence, that's when I'll lean in on that coach speak a little bit more, which is seemingly what, you're saying here as well. So I think that's a really good way to sort of sift through all of that information. So speaking of all of this, given everything that we just talked about, have there been some players that you're drafting more frequently this month now than you've been drafting, let's say, in May, June, and July?
Yeah, so unfortunately, you just gave me kind of one example of a player that I'm drafting more. Josh Jacobs. I was super in on Marshawn Lloyd because, like you said, there's a lot of evidence. We have a lot of history of Green Bay using a split backfield. Marshawn Lloyd is kind of this exciting new player. The coaches were also, speaking about him glowingly, like this guy could be a big hit for us this season. Now he's got kind of an injury, and that's kind of making me a little bit more afraid of Marshawn Lloyd. And then I think, okay, yeah, sure, they might want to use a rotation, but we have a long sample of A.J. Dillon maybe not being the best RB2. So I do think like it's more likely that Josh Jacobs takes on a bigger workload now if Marshawn Lloyd is going to miss time, not going to be NFL ready this year. So I'm buying in on Josh Jacobs, just kind of responding again to the news that is coming out of Green Bay. Jordan Mason, another one of those examples that I gave earlier, just, buying into, maybe he's the RB2. They've talked about him glowingly in the past, would be a super valuable role if he does land that RB2 role. Plus Christian McCaffrey a little bit banged up. So, you kind of get worried a little bit already with sort of aging backs. This makes me a little bit even more worried about Christian McCaffrey, the fact that he has an injury right now, which then of course in turn makes me more bullish on a guy like Jordan Mason. There are a lot of players that I am drafting more now than I had been. And it is just for me, generally a response to the news that is coming out.
Yeah, it makes sense. And the Josh Jacobs stuff, what's really interesting too, is that oftentimes, and maybe you've seen differently, but it doesn't seem like his ADP has shifted that much since the Marshawn. Yeah, right. So like in instances like that, like for me, Jacobs was more or less, I say fade. I was probably at like 4% or something like that with 4 or 5% or so. And I was heavy on Marshawn Lloyd, let's say like a 13, 14 to 15% or something. But when news like this happens, I have found it as I'm going on this journey of becoming a best ball bro and doing more and more drafts. I have found that the reaction, as it happened, sure, like if you're in a singular draft, like yesterday after the Jahmyr Gibbs news hit, I did do a BBM and he did go in the mid-second round. It wasn't, he wasn't a 1-2 turn guy, but there are still some players where like it's not as glaring and obvious and the draft capital isn't as high, like a Josh Jacobs, where it seems like there's a slower reaction, to that injury occurring. And you could make the same argument for someone like Kenneth Walker, where it's not even related to injury or anything, but we've gotten some favorable reports. We've heard them talking about him strictly as a pass catcher. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I got a lot of Charbonnet because of the contingent upside and such. And so, but then, I was at like 5% Kenneth Walker. Now I'm just getting, his ADP has barely shifted. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I can now kind of hedge this pretty easily because nothing's really changing with Kenneth Walker due to what the coach speak is and what's out there right now. So that's been kind of shocking to me. Have you found that happening as well?
Yeah, I mean, that happens all the time. It's not, I think like Underdog, it's a pretty sharp community in general.
Yes,
so I think most of the time, like the reactions are kind of appropriate, but I'm surprised every year. Last year it was Alexander Madison. When Dalvin Cook got cut, it was like, we already knew this was going to happen, but still when Alexander Madison became the running back, he jumped like 3 rounds in ADP. So there are still inefficiencies like that where you see the market, I thought this was baked in and it wasn't baked in as much as I thought. And then, you give, that is the perfect example with Kenneth Walker, where it's like everything is so bullish, yet the market isn't really budging there in general. Michael Pittman, I would throw out there as well. Josh Downs has a high ankle sprain. We don't know how much time he's going to miss. I was pretty out on Michael Pittman. This just makes him a little bit more viable at ADP than he was previously. So, there's situations where it's like, the ADP is not really budging. I feel like it should be budging. Maybe now is a time to buy in on that player.
Yeah. Yeah. And get some exposure. And now I'm not going to feel crappy if and when Kenneth Walker has a monster season this year, because I'm getting my exposure to him. You know, it's nice. So by the time this publishes, we've had this crazy drama going on with Brandon Aiyuk. So who knows what's going to happen, you know, with that Aiyuk situation. But at a high level, when there is that uncertainty in the market, do you find yourself buying into that uncertainty or just kind of letting another team deal with it? Like, for instance, with this Aiyuk stuff, have you been drafting Debo higher? You know, obviously, if Aiyuk leaves, then Debo will be a 1-2 turn guy consistently, right? And then at the same time, maybe you're avoiding George Pickens because Pickens probably loses it. I mean, at least a round, maybe 2 rounds of ADP and value, you know, if Aiyuk were to go to Pittsburgh. Have you reacted to that at all? Or are you kind of just saying, you know, I've drafted a certain way over the last 3 months. I don't need to necessarily lean into that situation, you know, because of the way my portfolio currently looks?
Yeah, I definitely react pretty quickly to these things. That example, I felt really sharp for a little while, not looking as sharp now, but I was doing a ton of Brandon Aiyuk gets traded teams. So I was drafting, you know, Debo mid-second, then take Kittle, you know, maybe slightly ahead of ADP, add Ricky Pearsall onto that team, and just doing these Niner stacks that just like you make the assumption that Brandon Aiyuk gets traded. Well, suddenly all of these guys look like awesome values. So right. I did plenty of those types of builds when it was looking more like Aiyuk would get traded. They weren't really Debo budged in ADP. Like Debo was going a little bit earlier. Yeah. We didn't really see that much budge from Kittle or Pearsall. Right. So it's still really easy to get them. Yeah, I was taking advantage of that. Like these guys could be absolutely smash picks at ADP if Aiyuk gets traded. And for a little while, I was looking more likely than not that he would be traded. So I was very much buying in a ton of Kittle and Pearsall and to some extent Debo. But as I said, Debo did move up, so it wasn't, you know, as much of a value there. But yeah, I was very much buying in on the Aiyuk stuff. And at the same time, you could have played it the other way. I didn't do as much of the buy in the dip on Aiyuk. And Pickens, actually, both Aiyuk and Pickens were kind of dipping for a little while. I kind of wish that I had played it that way more. I was leaning pretty heavily into the Aiyuk does get traded. I wish that I had leaned a little bit more into in some lineups, in different lineups. You don't want to do it within the same lineup, but in some lineups, making the bet that Aiyuk doesn't get traded and, you know, take advantage of the dip on both Brandon Aiyuk and George Pickens because, you know, they're dipping from where they were and the situation potentially has not changed. So I do like reacting to the news, and I'm not afraid to play it both ways, to play it like Aiyuk gets traded, to play it like Aiyuk doesn't get traded. You can kind of try and build unique super teams. And at the end of the day, like my teams that I built where I made the assumption that Aiyuk would get traded, it's not like they're dead. Like as I said, I was getting Pearsall and Kittle at ADP anyway, or close to ADP.
Yeah, so, I think that's the key is like when you don't have to manipulate ADP and like reach for these guys by a crazy amount, why not just do that and lean into the you know, whether it be 50-50 chance at the time or whether it be even a 5% chance. Because like at the end of the day, we all have been talking about this all year about how the second round of these best ball drafts are just so flat, right? And how like a wide receiver you get at the end of the second round is not that much different than a wide receiver you're getting at the front of the second round. So if you're taking Debo there, it's like, okay, that's not that big of a deal because Debo was close enough to that kind of tier of player anyway, if not in that tier to begin with. And then on top of that, like you said, you know, it was shocking. This is just another example. Like, why wasn't George Kittle's ADP shifting that dramatically? Like realistically, without Brandon Aiyuk, I mean, Kittle would be drafted where Dalton Kincaid goes more than likely, right? Like that's what we're looking at. But he was still in the 6th round. He was still going typically after Kyle Pitts. When this is at the peak of the Aiyuk stuff, obviously, you know, now things have shifted a little bit. And, you know, we can sit here and say, oh, those people were right who weren't going after the George Kittle stuff. It's like, no, we're playing probability here, right? At the end of the day. And I do think that, you know, getting a guy like Pickens during that uncertainty and that weird period, Kittle made a lot of sense, right? So yeah, that's a really good call though, to like build these lineups independently based on these different events kind of going down. I like that a lot. One question that I've asked a lot on this show is about tight end. Right. It seems deeper at the top this year where we feel pretty comfortable with the top 5 or 6 and maybe 7, 8, maybe even up to 10, right? Like you're looking at guys like David Njoku who, you know, are very, very solid picks, you know, closer to that double-digit round range. But there don't seem to be a ton of late round gems like we had last year, where it was very glaring and obvious as to who to pick late at the tight end position with all that. I mean, it was a fantastic rookie class, and then obviously some other guys emerged too, like a Jake Ferguson or a Trey McBride. Are there any late round tight ends that you like love versus consensus this year? Or is it more of a, I'm just building them based off of what my stacks kind of look like?
I don't know that I'd say love relative to consensus, but yeah, there have been late round tight ends that I target. Michael Mayer is a guy that I have been drafting pretty frequently as a last round pick. You can get him in the last round on any site you want to, basically. He's almost always there. I think that he has more standalone value than people are assuming. I think that he is going to be used even with Brock Bowers there, and then obviously major contingent upside if something happens to Bowers. Yeah. So I kind of feel like he's a kind of a floor / has more ceiling than maybe he's given credit for. Tyler Conklin, a guy that I have drafted a lot of. I just, you look at his stats from last year. He had 61 receptions, 0 touchdowns. That is the most receptions in the NFL to not score a touchdown. I think that it's pretty clear that, and that's without Aaron Rodgers. So I think you add Aaron Rodgers into the mix, a little bit of touchdown regression. I think that the ceiling is there. I was asked on a show yesterday if I'm worried at all about Jeremy Ruckert, which maybe I should be. Maybe that's not a factor that I have not been considered enough, but I have not been super worried about Jeremy Ruckert. I think that Tyler Conklin should have a big role there. Noah Fant, another guy that I think is just in an offense that should be throwing more, has some upside there. So I wouldn't say that there's any I love this guy in the final round this year. I think in past years, I have had more conviction on late round tight ends, and a lot of them have not really worked out for me. So maybe I'm a little bit gun shy now because I've been so wrong on late round tight ends. I was totally out on Trey McBride last year, for example. Yeah. So I'm not trying to make that guess as much this year. Theo Johnson's sort of interesting. Jonnu Smith, another guy that I think the range of outcomes I think is pretty wide for Jonnu Smith. Could be just another ancillary passing option in the Dolphins offense that just does absolutely nothing. But then you hear Mike McDaniel talk about it what happened last year is not guaranteed to happen this year. And I'm thinking, well, Jonnu could be a guy that they try to get involved a little bit. So I think that there are some interesting late round tight ends. I don't think that I feel particularly great about any of them, like they're slam dunk, guaranteed, floor. I think there's ceiling picks, but I don't think there's a ton of floor late at tight end this year.
Yeah, it's been really hard for me to have over 12% exposure to some of those late round tight ends because I'm just kind of throwing darts evenly, because there's just a lot of guys. Like you said, you just mentioned a handful of them, even the Colby Parkinsons of the world. It's sure,
correlate with my quarterback.
Yeah, right. I think that's probably the move. And then you got to hope that the guy that you're a little bit more overweight on just kind of ends up being the tight end that hits. Because look, chances are there's going to be one or two of these guys in the late rounds that end up being, because we see it every year, that end up being fringe top 10 guys. So I'm with you overall. Are you for or against? I don't even know if I've talked about this on the series so far, but are you for or against a double elite tight end build? I know a lot of people have talked about this and have implemented it as well. Sort of the theory being that not only are you getting, awesome production at the tight end position, but you're also hurting the rest of your room to some degree because they're now seeing a lesser tight end on their roster because you're gobbling up 2 of them. But flip side, opportunity cost is high in doing that. You're weaker at the other positions. Are you doing that at all or often?
Yeah, I would say I'm doing it not super frequently. It also depends kind of how you define elite tight end. If you're defining it as, the top 7 tight ends where the ADP is 65 or higher, I would say I'm generally opposed to it. I would prefer not to do it. I still do it occasionally. And normally when I do it, it will be if I have 2 great tight ends that both correlate with other players on my team, or, I look at the other available options there and it's okay, Calvin Ridley or George Kittle, and there are other wide receivers that I prefer later over Calvin Ridley. So I can take George Kittle now, be done at tight end, and then I like those later. I'm trying to think who would be a later wide receiver option, Lad McConkey, or somebody in that ilk where it's I don't feel that much better about Calvin Ridley anyway. So depending on what's available, I am willing to do double elite tight end. But then I'm if you expand elite tight end to David Njoku, Brock Bowers, Dallas Goedert, then I'm pretty into it. In part because I really don't feel that great about any tight ends after like Dallas Goedert. Like it gets pretty thin in a hurry for me at tight end. So due to like kind of my lack of confidence in the later tight ends, if I can just end with 2 tight ends in the like Dallas Goedert or better range, I do it honestly pretty frequently. And maybe it's just because I'm too nervous about those later tight ends, but just being able to finish with 2 tight ends, feel like I'm pretty solid there. I'm pretty into taking 2 tight ends in that range. So it's top 7, probably not all that often. I'd prefer not to take 2 tight ends of the top 7 group, willing to do it in rare scenarios. But if you expand the elite tight end to include guys like Dallas Goedert, then I'm pretty into it.
Yeah, I've done that too. I've done that a lot with Brock Bowers, especially just because we know there's a lot of volatility to that profile. And if he ends up hitting, then that's great. And you're not giving your league mates either that chance to have that crazy upside that he has. But we know there's that volatility, and you can still get by if that volatility doesn't hit if you do have one of those earlier tight ends. So I'm definitely with you with some of those builds. All right, now before I let you go, give us a couple of your favorite targets, just anywhere in the draft, guys that you're heavily exposed to this year.
Yeah, I'm pretty into the Arizona offense in general. So in the passing game more so, I'm trying to get more in on James Conner. Unfortunately, I'm trying to get more in on James Conner while the entire field is trying to get more in on James Conner. So that's been tougher. But I've been buying into Marvin Harrison Jr. Like I know a lot of people are worried about him being a rookie coming in. Maybe he's not going to be great his rookie year. I'm willing to make the bet that he is going to be a rookie. Just bet on the talent and the situation. He moves into a situation where he should be the wide receiver 1 immediately. So I'm into Marvin Harrison. Trey McBride, I think, is still a pretty great pick. And then of course I love Kyler. You and I actually talked about this yesterday a little bit, that I don't usually take Kyler unless I have one of or both of Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison Jr. But if I have either of them and Kyler Murray comes to me anywhere near ADP, I'm slamming it. I love betting on that offense. I love betting on that week 17 game environment with the Rams. If I can do a full game stack there of the Cardinals and Rams, I love to do that. So I would say the Cardinals, definitely an offense that I'm really into this year. The Green Bay passing game, to some extent, I do have a lot of Dontavian Wicks. It's becoming a worse bet, I think, now as he's kind of getting steamed up. So if he gets into that top 100 picks, then I'm starting to take my foot off the gas a little bit. But I have been pretty into buying into the latter part of that Green Bay passing offense. Seahawks, Bears, I think that's a week 17 game. Both the Seahawks and the Bears, kind of into both of those offenses. I kind of think Caleb might start to get steamed up now, but he hasn't really moved as much as I expected him to after the great preseason showing. So I think buying into that game environment in general is one that I like quite a bit.
Yeah, those are all good calls, and I definitely agree. The Seattle one, like I've Geno Smith is one of my highest rostered quarterbacks right now, just because I don't really see a difference. I've talked about this a lot with like pocket passing quarterbacks. When you get into the pocket passers, if you don't, obviously you're not going to draft a naked Tua if you don't have Jalen Waddle, or hopefully you're not drafting a naked Tua. I just don't see a big difference between like Geno Smith to Tua. Like at the end of the day, like is there really the way they score points and what they might be able to do this season? So I'd rather just take the value, and then obviously there's many outs to get a Seahawks wide receiver or Seahawks piece to be able to pair him with Geno Smith. So I love those calls. Neil, it was great to chat with you, man. Let everyone know where they can find you and your work.
Yeah, so my work is all over the place. You can find me on Twitter at PlayerQDFS. I'll be doing work for Fantasy Points this year, Roto Grinders, 4for4, and then of course I have my own YouTube channel called The Flannelverse, where I will be doing showdown breakdowns this NFL DFS season. But yeah, primarily on Twitter at PlayerQDFS. Awesome. I'm on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Make sure you check out the Late Round Draft Guide over on LateRound.com. Take advantage of that underdog promo. You can get that guide for absolutely free with promo code LateRound. But otherwise, everyone, as always, thanks for tuning in.